Okay. Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to today's episode. I'll officially begin it. The title is When 8 billion and more inner children peacefully play. You know, guys, I've been thinking about this idea that we human beings have access to memory, and memory is like an additional layer and level of life that we experience. You know, in this episode, the idea of the inner child, the idea of how our memories of our youth are affecting us, and the concept of how Carl Jung came up with the divine child archetype, the inner child idea, that's very important to acknowledge, and pretty much in this episode, that's what I'm going to be looking at. To me, when it comes to just living, I have an approach just from the beginning of my life that I've had. And that is that anytime I don't understand reality, I understand that its designs are accessible to me. That means a person can look at nothing, or a person could look at something that's there, but still see nothing in it. So in some sense, the inner realms have a special sort of mobility. You see, Carl Jung, he brought forth this concept of archetypes, and I'm going to read for the audience something. So it says, in popular psychology and analytical psychology, the inner child is an individual's childlike aspect. It includes what a person learned as a child before puberty. The inner child is often conceived as a semi-independent sub-personality, subordinate to the waking conscious mind. Psychologist Carl Gustav Jung, 1875 to 1961, originated the concept in his divine child archetype. Now, guys, I am not that much of a Jungian to tell you exactly how Carl Jung spoke about the inner child, but I've perceived a lot of quotes of Carl Jung speaking about transformation. And you can totally see that the concept of our inner child, you know, it is in some sense our modern or our present relationship with our memory. You know, somehow every day we wake up, we are older than our memories. And what are memories? If the biological body was perceived as a sort of camera, that means imagine what we call the human organism is actually a very unique and advanced camera. And so this camera not only records the video of its environment, it doesn't only consume the senses, the origin of the brain, but in some sense it edits the content as it receives it and then simultaneously expresses it again. Do you know? It's like a camera that's constantly resetting the stage. And so the mind is, of course, doing something, you know. When it comes to inquiry into intelligence, the only reason I'm speaking about this concept of the inner child is because there's deeper dimensions to the human being that we have not explored. And certain psychologists and scholars in history have explored it, but we have not finished and we're not done exploring. That means there's so much to the world that cannot fit in our language. You know, in certain contexts, we can say a simple understanding of the inner child is that when the human being was young, when every human being who was very young, the psychology had not developed in accordance to a personality. So I would say children are not actually children to themselves. Children are just moments of sight, as if one-sided receiving from the camera, as if children are cameras that are recording the world, the footage, like their memories are like the film of the world that the brain projects. Now, the child doesn't have an identity. The child is actually an energetic being. You know, I poetically say that there's a language, you know, there's different languages. That means before, okay, so right now, I would say I'm speaking English, but before I can speak English, I need to actually understand, how would I tell you? I need to understand mathematical language because of the space between the words. And in order to understand the alphabet, we need chronology, we need numerology. So mathematics is actually the skeletal language of all the other languages, right? So I would say that, okay, so right now I'm speaking in English. If I was to look at really what I'm doing, though it's a mathematical relationship, and if I really look at the source of the mathematical, eventually it becomes experience oriented. And when it goes to experience, that means before we spoke the language of word, a language that is that utilizes words, we were actually, I have this theory that when the child is born, it actually starts speaking an emotional language. The tears of the child, crying child, when it comes from the womb, do you know? Those tears are in some sense an awakening to an emotional dimension of reality. And if we were to understand our emotions, we would the emotions of a child that is born, we would recognize it as temperature. That means there is something about emotions being very similar to a temperature relationship. You know, when it gets too hot, we burn. When we get too angry, the karma of the moment just becomes turbulent, right? Or when it gets too cold, you know, the person stops behaving. When the human psychology becomes depressed, it's as if the temperature of the mind has frozen the moment, you know. We can say victory is like above room temperature and defeat is below room temperature. If we were to kind of consider that there's an emotional language. And of course, don't get me wrong, so think of it this way. There's a biological language, then there's an emotional language, then there is a numerical language, and then from the numerical language we have our current languages today. I would give it that kind of progression. And what's incredible is that our memories can be like systems of movement that were never shut down. Right? Sometimes I honestly, guys, wonder about this. I wonder, just like how, not poetically, but how in academia we had an influential figure by the name of David Chalmers. You know, And David Chalmers spoke about the hard problem of consciousness. And the hard problem of consciousness wanted to get to the truth of why is it that we experience certain emotions, why is it that we don't experience certain phenomenology, and why is it that, if, for example, we are not fully in control of the body. Like, it is true, we say that people have their independence, their sovereignty, their freedom, and they have their free will. But when we really look at the application of the free will as a mind, it can move the limbs, but a person can't just stop their heart. Do you know? A person cannot change, certain components of nature that are way more interconnected. That means I may look at my biological body and be like, yeah, a name and a form. The name owns the form. My personality, my name, the idea of me is owning this body. But at the same time, the natural universe could be like, nothing, Jon Snow, in this in the sense that our attachment to the biology, that means it could be that the greatest blindfold for human intelligence is actually, and this is a very bold and controversial statement, but knowledge could be the blindfold to the direct reality being experienced in the unknown. But this statement is not one to engage, it's just one to hear. So what I'm trying to say is that right now we are a character in a story. The brain is kind of like a camera. The brain has recorded real moments that we have in some sense been a character in different storylines. That means the story of life I was telling myself when I was 10 years old, I wasn't actually telling myself a story of life. But let's say after I was, pretty much after middle school, the story of life became more and more significant. It's as if I personally remember moments in my childhood where, it's so strange. It's as if energetically I don't feel different. I just feel like existence. If existence was a feeling, we're all feeling it, Excuse me. I would say this, that this is the takeaway from what I've so far said. I'm saying that the body is a recording device. It records, and what it records is reprojected back outwards. It's as if our brains are taking sensory perception, kind of like the brain's like, gimme. The brain, the brain wants all the senses. It takes the sensory perception. You know what it is? It's like the brain is copy pasting the outer realms, and the outer realms is like a sound. Right? It's like somebody hitting a bell, right? So that sound echoes, and so it's as if the copy-paste version of the objective realm echoes behind our eyes, and as it is echoing, it's as if behind our eyes, imagine, you know what it is? Imagine one's memory to be similar to a giant dark room. So I want everybody listening to me to realize that when you close your eyes, you find yourself in a giant dark room. That giant dark room, it's kind of, or I should say it in better metaphor, rather than a giant dark room, it is like an unknown ocean, right? And you don't know what is lurking deep within the ocean of your mind. I've been astonished sometimes. Sometimes in these talks, I've come to talk about A, and instead of going to B, suddenly my mind's jumped to the letter D, for example. You know what I mean? Or the letter Z. You know, sometimes when I look at a system, you know what's hilarious? Behind our eye, in front of our eyes, it's one step at a time. You know, but behind our eyes, it is instantaneous. The brain, excuse me, not the brain, the mind and its space of not manipulation but navigation of form is equivalent to teleportation technology. Our brain is teleporting itself, and when it remembers the past, it is instantly in that moment teleporting itself to that image of the past. That means it's recreation. So it's another way of saying that the moment is endlessly recreating itself, and what it uses to recreate itself is the archive of experiences that it has familiarized itself with. You know, because in psychology, when one even examines the relationship of the brain with how it is being human, we have something called as if the short-term memory of the person and the long-term memory of the person. And I don't know how many people know this, and they don't teach this in schools. But what it is this idea that if something is more experientially real to you, you remember it. So I'll give you an example. Imagine, you know, you want to learn like the idea. Okay, so for example, there is something, a weapon that ninjas use, for example. And it's called the shuriken, okay? People maybe have seen it in movies. It's kind of like that spike thing, you know, that plus sign thing that ninjas throw, okay? So now imagine you're a person and you want to remember the word shuriken, okay? Shuriken, I don't know how to pronounce it exactly, okay? But let's say you're a person, you want to remember, you want to interlink the word shuriken to the object that's being thrown by a ninja, okay? So the brain has two options. You're like, somebody tells you this object equals shuriken, and the brain can remember it that way. Or the brain can imagine being in somewhere. Imagine you're talking to a ninja and you want to see that weapon in their hand. And so in your inner realms, you're simulating what that experience would be if you're asking a ninja about like their weapon, and it's like if you don't know the name, you might feel embarrassed in front of the ninja. So in the inner realms, through subtler internal experiencing, one actually, this word doesn't exist, but it should, realifies. Realifies. I'm not even pronouncing the word I'm creating properly, you know, but it's as if one brings to reality something that is distant, you know. So if you remember, imagine a ninja telling you that this weapon is a shuriken and gifting you with that. It's like in your inner realms has more reason to remember that. Do you see? So the more animated your inner realms are, the more it enters the long term. This is a suggestion that actually we have this impression, we have the short-term memory, the surface of the ocean, and the long-term memory, the depths, but it's the opposite. The long-term memory is closer. That means anybody who connects whatever they are perceiving to some sort of reality that they have experienced, it's impossible to forget it, because it's as if you interlink concepts to experience. And nobody says this, but behind your eyes you can attain experience without moving. This is called, by the fools, visualization. By the wise, it is called your geometrical inner realm birthright. It's our birthright. We have access to an advanced technology. The mind is not an object and it is not a subject, it is the functioner. It is the one that is functioning the intelligence. In some sense, it cannot be defined. It's as if it's like we're looking at somebody's shoes when they're walking, and then imagine we're like, yo, is the shoe walking? No. There's an intelligence that is not made of the shoe, in the shoe, that is causing the shoe to move, Similarly, there is something deeper about human intelligence that surpasses all the attempts of humanity to understand it. Simply said, language is not enough. The letters of all alphabets have failed us in trying to actualize a point of location in the void. You know what that means? That means, dear listeners, we are on a rock in the middle of nowhere, and we have started this massive storytelling, noumenon, phenomenon, whatever way you want to perceive it, from the inner realm or the outer realm. But we have started this kind of, it's kind of strange. They teach kids spelling, and it's as if human beings that use language to coordinate, it's as if a giant spell is cast on the species. And this spell, is not good or bad, it is just strange. It's as if the human being has a temporary body which is known, but it has a subjective mind that is unknown and can't fathom even the through absence the possibility of eternal birth. Anytime something is made real, it is remembered easily. Something that is made abstract, it's another way of saying in the inner realms, the more abstract the idea is, the more inner events are connected to it. I think I did something pretty incredible, but I don't know, the world will decide. I looked at the concept of the atom, and I looked at the spelling of the word atom, A-T-O-M. And my attention was caught on the letter T. And I was like, if the atom is being considered, by the masses as the smallest particle, it's being considered as the smallest particle of matter, in the outer realms. I thought, what is the smallest particle in the inner realms? And I went into this deep meditation wondering really what is looking through my eyes. And you know what I realized, guys? That the most accessible and we're not able to fully communicate it, but I'll tell you, the most simplest state behind the inner realms is eventhood. So in front of our eyes, it's character in a worldhood, but behind our eyes, it's invisible attention, invisible eventhood. So the simplest moment of the mind is an event, is the first reference point, which is an event. Some sort of recording of from point A to point B, and that point A to B created the first memory. Now, I thought of, we have the word atom, and this is where I felt I did something incredible. I created the term, I designed the term eventum. The word event, it's as if there's this thing, I actually coined this concept too. I call it letter linking. So the first letter and the last letter of words, if words were seen to be robots, they kind of like link together. Right, so I thought of the word T-O-M, and I thought of the word event, and I connected the T's. So I came up with the concept that the smallest unit of mind should be called an eventum, in order to somehow connect it to particle theory. It's another way of saying, it's like Mr.Within is saying, hey humanity, the outer realms is made of atoms and the inner realm is made of eventums. And eventums can have a negative and a positive view, but that beyond dualism, there's realities to the particle. Anyways, I'll connect this all to the inner child, guys. I just wanted to explain to the listeners that when it comes to the human being, we're kind of like piling up information, and then we are kind of like, free will is recycling information or transforming sensory information into characterhood inside a story context. So I want to just bring to the attention of the listeners that how an object is being a subject is by recording various snapshots of that subjectivehood, right? Our memories are real, or they were real. Do you see how intense the concept of memory is? So anybody who remembers their childhood, you have access to your inner child. If you're someone who doesn't have access to memories of your childhood, it's as if you're getting a new inner child reset. What appears as a human being is actually multiple events of intelligence taking place. And not only these events are simultaneously taking place, but based on how animate of an archetype is placed in the inanimate is alive. So what I'm trying to say is, a person can close their eyes, go back to their childhood, find an incredible moment where they were happy, playful, running in the sun, playing soccer, and just that moment in the sun where it was pleasant and it was an incredible moment in the memory, the person can remember it, right? And as I'm speaking it, I'm already there in my inner realm, in that memory, right? So the brain can evoke past moments of its own creation. So the memory is another way of saying the brain is doing something familiar again, you know? They say history repeats itself. I think no, it's the memory of the psychology. Our brains are experiencing the world completely different than how our psychology is experiencing the world. The brain doesn't have an identity. You know, that means we give too much claim to the brain. You know, it's like giving an award to just one person in a giant project. You know, like a lot of editors, for example, in the film industry, who they are kind of like the cherry on the cake of the film. They, in some sense, are not acknowledged. There's so many people who their efforts live on, but they're not seen, right? You know, it's kind of like I'm saying, you've opened your eyes in a world and you have a brain, and this brain is projecting films that the outer realms direct, and it's also projecting films that the inner realms direct. And based on how much life force is consciously active for the individual, the life moves. Anyways, every person has access to memory, pretty much. That means you have access to your inner child. Your inner child is a simpler self. All our memories are simpler selves, you know. Even though a person's past may be chaotic, you know, and they may have unconsciously piloted through that chaos, but still the past is simpler because the future can be incredibly complex. The moment the future can be incredibly complex, it's another way of saying that your inner child can resurface. I personally think that human beings have access to a dimension of gentleness, you know, and if you take it from the Vedic standpoint, it's as if a human incarnation means you can taste heaven on earth, but you cannot go to heaven, right? Because heaven, ultimately, for a mind that is not an object, is not a location. And it's a location only in the sense that if the mind is like a coin, and on one side of it, it's a non-physical watcher, is the non-physical observer, and on the other side of the coin, it is the physical observer. The inner child is how, when life was simpler, there was less a desire. Every time I go back into my memories, in my youth, I realized I had very little desire. I had vitality to go after things like, go play around outside, climb trees. I actually climbed a lot of trees when I was young. But it was as if my memories were simpler models of reality. It's as if my past senses of self, they each had made their own experiential attempt in existence. So what that means is our memories are efforts of our intelligence in the world. Our memories are simulations of self. We can say very safely that every human being has actually experienced multiple dimensions of their self, and it is actually impossible to move in the space-time continuum and to still be the same self. That means if your body is moving in the space-time continuum, and also the world is moving in the space-time continuum, it is impossible to believe in some sort of system of thought. That means it's like the self is changing and the world is changing, so it's as if to whom is the belief there, right? The only way we can believe something is if we are a soul that surpasses the space-time continuum. Because anything in the space-time continuum is changing. That means theoretically it should be impossible for us to be individuals in a changing world. I feel many other continental philosophers may back me up on this, but the value of the statement is just the suggestion that in order to bring forth an advanced humanity, we require systems that engage the human archetype and they engage the dehumanized archetype. Right? And it's what's strange is that our memories of our childhood are humanized archetypes, but beyond the earliest memory of childhood, it is the edge of the not only language threshold, you can poetically say it's the edge of your memory threshold. So we fast forward into the future, we come to the unknown, we rewind and we come to the unknown. And due to the changing nature of reality, there is no way that individualism cannot be a mirage. That means somehow 8 billion creatures have built a world for 8 billion individuals, but individualism is on thin ice, right? Especially in a world where our access to it is as our whole moment, you know? So, let's say 8 billion human beings suddenly realized that in each of their memories, you know, in their childhood, this is going to all human beings who've experienced some sort of childhood, and it doesn't matter how intense your childhood was. I mean, to the personality, to the persona, it matters. But to in regards to what kind of childhood a person has had, as long as you have lived through levels of selfhood. As the person has lived through levels of selfhood, they must first immediately check and see how many of their memories they have access to. That means, imagine right now, you know, there was an, let's say it's in the future, in some parallel sci-fi angle of looking at things, right? Let's say an advanced extraterrestrial species that is unknown to us lands on Earth. And this extraterrestrial species, the aliens, don't have mouths, okay? They don't have like mouths like we do. Let's say they have eyes, but they don't have mouths. And so our species has to, in some sense, figure out what method these extraterrestrials are using to communicate to us, you know, and which means we need to have such an advanced civilization in the future that even if there was an internal extraterrestrial invasion, because if honestly, I mean, think about it. If an extraterrestrial was in the sky and saw the human species, it would realize its language. We're all slaves to the language that gives color to our life, right? So only if we seek beyond the simulation that has been painted by nature, it's like we access the beyond, right? So I want to see a human species that it has access to all levels. And let's say, you know, through the poet's eyes, God forbid, let's say the extraterrestrial decides to attack, there's an internal extraterrestrial invasion. It would be as if all the advanced communicators in our civilization would instantly give a command to people, sit down, close your eyes, and check your memories. You know, and human beings all around the planet would have the capability to just sit still and silent and be like, okay, let me see what type of intelligence do I have access to. Let's say you're a person, you believe in this, mirage called the writer's block. I don't believe that shit exists. You know, it depends what kind of writer you are, and that's how you get blocked. In reality, there is so much information in the world that it's impossible to not see something progress forward, you know. I would say that the first act of a species in retaliation to internal warfare is strengthening the human archetype. That means if there was suddenly a question of, hey, is something else interfering with the human space of mind, where 8 billion mind spheres are kind of keeping civilization afloat. You know, the birds and squirrels, you know, and animals, other animals in nature, they don't care about this idea of the future or an advanced civilization. Humans are the only ones, you know. Strangely, the advanced civilization is a gift that humanity gave itself, but it planted the seeds and the future enjoyed the fruit. The inner child is a remembrance to how you were the logos before your last memory. And the logos is the watcher of the moment beyond personality. That means human decency only arrives because the mind fathoms greater possibilities with it. I don't consider myself as a cruel person, But I would say that when I think about the future, there is no way all ideas are going to survive. And just like how in every generation there's lost technology, there's lost treasure. Do you see? It's as if humanity's approach to the future, it's as if everybody has to carry their past into the future by remembering the journey's origin. An experience of advanced intelligence is the ultimate salvation beyond the sensory dimension. 8 billion human beings for a moment, like imagine guys, and I'll just say it this way, we're all human beings, and when we look at others, whatever age, we cannot ignore that all conscious moments of intelligence, or most unconscious moments of intelligence, have access to their memory. There's been moments where, for example, in life, I have been oblivious to certain desires of my own past self, and as I have gone in the future, that past self archetype has appeared, and then I've been like, oh my god, I missed out on all those desires. It's as if like our sense of self is changing, and as we remember how we were early in life, our cluelessness was our innocence, right? And so imagine somebody finds themselves in a moment of internal suffering, right? They just have to they have to find in their realms a moment, they have to try to remember a moment before how they felt now. And freedom comes as an inner simulation. Eight billion human beings remember through their childhood memories and innocence that had accepted the simplicity of the unknown before wanting to fight the complexity of the unknown. And pretty much it's as if like every person has to for a second see, when they see other people, they have to see their inner child. I would say this is the beginning of a wise society, that we care for who people have been to themselves, not only what they are in the moment to us. That would be an advanced humanity. So I'm saying that in any moment, a person can simplify life and can complexify it, let's say. And what that means is you can zoom in on one dimension that simplifies life, or you can try to see as far as possible, which makes life multidimensional. And to be able to be your simple self in a complex world that's endlessly commanding people to change, I will tell you, it's as if I'm here giving these talks, but at some point if you find a mirror and through that mirror you discover your true nature, wherever you are listening, that is sacred wisdom enough, you know. And so, as children play peacefully because they don't have any ideology of war, they have no battle to fight. It's as if 8 billion human beings, regardless of what level of age and where they are on the mountain of life, whether on the climb up or the climb down, it's as if we start from childhood being incapable but enthusiastic. Then in the future we end up the type of society we've built, we become capable but non-enthusiastic. If we realize that the secret to the polymath's playful interconnectivity of the inner realm, the secret is that in a simple universe, complex reality cannot happen. And this is why there could be the most chaotic force on this planet. And if there is truly an entity, a creature that is super simple to itself truly super simple, in some sense, it cannot experience anything other than that simplicity. So if the universe is like, all right, creatures have brains, their brains are projecting probabilities of movement, right? And it's as if like, which probability of movement should I allow in the outer realms? As if the guy in mind was wondering what human beings are doing. It's like the first time human beings realize the planet is alive, and we start talking to the planet, and the planet, the first time it talks to us, it's angry. You know, and the planet, imagine the planet is like, why do none of you guys pick up your intuitive phones? You know, why don't you listen to the intuition, you know, that comes to you out of all the things that can come to you in life. You know, there's a force called time, and it is our ultimate spirit guide. Time is literally like, you know, an escort to truth. We are being guided by our mortality to do something incredible in order to see if the immortal is there. That means, hilariously, it's like all of life is a game to see how real reality is. It's hilarious. That means we are still meddling with the surface. It's as if we have built boats, but we have not built submarines. And we have built the ego and the concept of the ego in the outer realms, but what is actually, you know, floating above the surface of the mind, the true unknown intelligence of the human being? It is honestly, let's say you transcend language, so there is no stories anymore, there is no character in a world. Then you transcend geometry, let's say, and geometry was image, so in some sense when you transcend images, there nothing becomes the ultimate teaching for everything. That means those beings in this simulation of reality that recognize emptiness is in the room first. It's not that one becomes materialist or, you know, through Freudian fear becomes a materialist. I'm saying, you know, it's kind of like, it's as if the world has mysteries, and this mystery is called to us, and our life's job is to respond to it. You know, if we make communication meditation the most important thing on the planet. The planets, all the 8 billion inner verses will be able to properly link to the outer verse. Our inner realms are like a film we project over the world, and everybody's mind is projecting their own film on the world. And the moment we can realize the mind is projecting a film and become super still and silent, I will tell you the perfect imagery like for meditation. It's literally like an old school projector projecting a film on a wall, and it's as if the person is standing beside the projector watching it. But instead of the projector, the person is being self-aware of how their mind functions. Right? So if the mind is seen as the creator of time, the mind is a phenomenon beyond time. So the mind, by definition, has to be eternal through the logic that what created time. Even though time has a connection also to the outer realms in the sense of what change, how matter changes in space. We are part of the intelligence of this universal sector, you know. You know, not to encourage transcendental egoism, but archetypes have to update. We have completed the era of the Homo sapien, and now we are going to a point where I would say we are going towards two types. I would say the solar sapien and the cyber sapien. Cyber sapien and the solar sapien. So what I mean by that is that I see pretty much human psychology making its allegiance to nature, which is light, and the soul is kind of like a light in that dark room. So in the future, if there's an evolutionary return of human beings, evolutionary return to nature, and simultaneously there's some human beings who decide to go into cyberspace. You know, it's as if the fastest way to freedom is to find a collective archetype that has an infinite room, so all human psychology can have its liberation of expressions. The brain is literally an instrument, okay? And right now, through, absolute objective realism, the brain is an instrument that's playing itself. And to get even more deeper about it, it's actually being played by the laws of nature. And strangely, free will is the counter response to the laws of nature. That means the only thing that is resisting nature is the free will, because it has to separate itself from everything to be an individual, right? So the type of intelligence we find, first view, it is unknown and endlessly explorable. The second view is that it narrows itself down to a self in a world. Third view, the self through stillness, if it doesn't move, you know, as a separate embodiment in the outer realms. Like if your physical body doesn't move and you're still, there's no way you can say if your mind is just in your body, it's just your body, or in some sense the whole moment is your mind, right? Because the mind is like, again, like the glow of a candle. When I see people, I see the unknown moving, unknown sources of intelligence moving. Before the mystical dimensions of my experience were found by I would say, my conscious waking state, I lived in this life really as just an image chaser. As if from the beginning of life, all right, I have this view now, image chase. And eventually I came to realize that the images I'm changing, by the definition of the brain doing something, must be a simulation. So what's hilarious is that our brain is simulating the experience of change. So think of it this way: the brain is reacting to change, then the brain is creating the experience of change. So the reaction of the brain to the world, that kind of interference is meshed in. So that means even though the sensory perception is accessible, one cannot say if it is true, right? And I'm not alone in this. There was a man by the name of René Descartes who introduced the mind-body dualism, but this man also had this perception that you can doubt the sensory world. And how can you doubt the sensory world, right? Just think about this idea for a second. How can a person doubt a physical world where they're experiencing with their eyes, right? We call it reality. I'm touching this table right now and I'm saying it's real, but René Descartes was like, yo, you can doubt this, right? So how can this be doubted? René Descartes gave an example that if you put a stick in like a pond and you look at the reflection of the stick in the pond, it gives the optical illusion that the stick is curving. So René Descartes was that as long as there's optical illusions, the outer realms can be doubted. He pretty much knocked out materialism in one jab, you know. The only thing he couldn't doubt was the isolated thinking subject, where then Hegel, as a sort of, I would say, holding his allegiance to analytical philosophy, kind of rebelled. I don't know if this is a fair statement to say, but the thought arose that I feel Hegel as a philosopher was like the Trojan horse of the analytical philosophers in continental philosophy. But also his metaphysics was deeper than that, so I can't say that. But anyways, ultimately I'm just trying to draw this picture that we as human beings, when we see each other, have to be like, yo, this human being in front of me used to be a child. You know what I mean? And that memory of their own childhood is accessible. And if we take the brain as like a projector of meaning, right? So every person, just like how they put on clothing, I think in every moment of personality expression, we put on whatever ideas that are in our inner space, right? And of course, through patience, one begins to observe their inner realms. That means, so a lot of people, I think they have forgotten that listening is a lost art. It's an art form. And someone is probably going to be like, Mr.Within, what do you say? How can listening be an art form, right? Because everybody's listening the same, right? We all hear the sound, right? But I will tell you, listening is an art form in regards to how the sounds that enter your ear translate into meaning. So that means when I hear people talk, I'm actually not seeing language in my inner realms. I'm trying to see a film, because when you see a film, you remember very easily. I'm not joking, guys. This is so true. If your way of learning things, it's as if they say a photograph is worth 1,000 words. Imagine now how much value a film has. $8 billion human beings, they realize they have access to their childhood. Our conscience is how our childhood held the world, and when we live differently than our childhood, that kind of response is natural. Right? I've had moments where, like, I wanted to do something, and then, for example, being raised in Iran, I had this notion of sin, and so I didn't do it. You know what I mean? It was like a restriction, kind of like a pass. You put a password, you know, in something, and it says unauthorized. You know? So to me, there was this sort of internal. I could tell you, it's strange. It's as if like the outer realms was its own film, but the inner realm is like as capable as one chooses to be. And I feel a lot of children are just roaming in a sort of states of non-decision, not realizing that in a world on a rock in the middle of nowhere, literally emptiness as far as you can see, space as far as you can see. So in the middle of space, it's our choice in regards to how much we select a conscious moment with whatever persona is found in that moment, and then there's a communication done, right? So in some sense, it's actually energy movement, but energy is speaking the language of image, brother. It's just the cultivation of decency on a global level through the logic that if human beings are patient, there will be less wars. That means before a person, let's say, does something, does an intense action, does a complex action or a simple action, they're actually in a state of non-action as space, right? That means honestly the mind is watching the world, then being itself, you know. It has access to sensory information and subjective echoes of the objective information. And so human beings should be treated just as advanced unknown technologies. We know that, for example, like when I see history, all the evil people in history, they were like, this is just another way of saying there was an advanced technology and it was misused. Or fascism was another way of saying an ego was trying to become a god. But the laws of nature are so profound, they are so vast. It's as if when the warrior that is, the solo warrior that went towards justice was in some sense outnumbered by injustice, all that the solo warrior could do was in some sense look at the sky and wonder if the world wasn't out. One's intelligence realizes that there is a movement to the inner realms. This movement, we tend to own it as the free will, but what the free will is just circumstance and something shifting the circumstance. It's as if our mind is a three-dimensional technology, is a cube, and our body is a plane. And so every plane, every step that this square makes, okay, it's as if it's like, wait a minute, are there parallel dimensions? And to the cube, it is multiple parallel dimensions. That means just like how we broke the atom and we found smaller particles. We broke like the, what do you call it? We broke the atom to a point where we couldn't see anything other than emptiness. Or technology did not have the capability to see further. And the concept of the atom, the word atomos, it means to cut something, right? So we broke the world into pieces to see if it means one thing. It's hilarious. But if I was to say if an atom, if the universe has a sort of microcosm, macrocosmic relationship, where as Plato says, as above, so below, right? So we find like geometrical patterns pretty much inside an object when we break it. And it's hard to say how much of that is the geometry of our eye and how much of that is actually the thing we're looking for. if human beings are even seen as players, not players, performers, actors, and the whole world in India, they had this concept of the Leela, and the whole world was seen as a play, as a theater. It's as if Mr. Within is just saying, hey, humanity, how about we allow the greatest performance of humanity arrive? What if we allow Project Humanity to begin? For the first time, the species and all the governing powers of the world were like, yeah, it's about time that we establish the human being as having an unknown dimension and a known dimension. And so really human beings are living between a spectrum of 100% unknown and 100% known. And there's so many worlds that could be in between. There's so many ways. And the more unknown variables there are, the more the inner realms animate the outer realms. The more known variables there are, the less reason it has to animate the outer realms. And it's saying like honesty is when the inner realms have completely remembered. The person's mind has remembered itself, regardless of how intensely the embodiment was being distorted, right? It's as if I am not talking to atoms right now. I am talking to intelligent, unknown, witnessing free will energy. I don't know how else to say. You know, the ancients called it a soul, but nowadays, you know, I never thought I'd see language discrimination where people are like, get that word out of here, man. You know? You know? And so unless we have freedom of expressionism, how dare we say humanity attempted the greatest challenge? If humanity is closing its eyes because it fears its future or has given up, that is in some sense ignorance, because nobody knows how the future will move. Do you know? The future is like a pizza we ordered and we don't know at what time it's going to arrive. Do you know? And I will tell you, it's been literally 2 hours, and it's like, I'm joking, but I'm saying, like, imagine. And now imagine instead of pizza, it's an advanced civilization. And we're like, wait a minute, why is the advanced civilization so late? Why is it that our minds can perceive a way more advanced world than we can actually invent and design in our outer realms? And the reason is because we have dwelled in our inner realms, and we actually, in our declaration as being conscious human beings, have disconnected ourselves with nature. But there's an advantage and a disadvantage to that. The disadvantage of disconnecting from nature is that you begin experiencing solo piloting karma. So you feel it's as if you are, as there was a term in Christianity, very profound, where attributed to the Christ, where he says to be in the world but not of it. There we go. To be in the world but not of it. And so imagine the same model, but now. It's as if we're in the world, we are in the here and now, you know, dated as to the year 2021 in the space-time continuum. But all of that is just, you know, carvings on a wall. You know, I have this theory that the earliest, it's not a theory, the earliest human drawings are actually kind of like how the earliest human beings were smart enough to find some sort of powder and pigment, take their hands, put it on the wall, and throw this powder on their hands to make a picture of like a hand, you know, on the wall of this kind of like cave. And years later, like imagine people on that field find those hand markings, right? So this is kind of like, this was in a documentary where I felt it was, you know, valid enough to trust. But the idea is that I feel, this is my theory now, that moment where the earliest artwork insanely actually showed the last artwork of humanity. I believe that hand, the symbol of the hand on the cave wall, was the first time traveler clue. You know, art is not from here. You know, creativity is its own world taking place as an event as the outer realms remains whatever it is. It's as if it's like an object doesn't care what the person imagines, right? And our imagination is real to its projector source, right? So every person's inner realms is like their private studio of, thought design. The evolution of the individual into the multidimensional human being. The multidimensional human being no longer lives in a world of good and bad, and the inner child, there is no longer archetypes of suffering or non-suffering. The intelligence of humanity has moved on. That means any human being suffering right now, technically suffering is whatever outer realm situation happens, the inner realms are animating it as well. The inner realms are listening to the suffering, right? So the inner realms can be directed and they can be commanded, and best analogy I have found to share with the world is the inner realms can be piloted. But the first immediate thing one has to realize is that their free will is the pilot in any moment and state of consciousness they find themselves in. This is the first big realization, right? That a person recognizes the presence of their own eyes in the space-time continuum. It's as if the honor of a lifetime, you saw humanity, at first through singular expressionism, then plural, I look at the world and I just see stuff everywhere. And I keep asking myself, what are humanity's options? Do we live like animals and like the birds and the squirrels? They just go find fruit or whatever and they just eat it. Are we going to just be fruit eaters till the end of time? Is that the right strategy? Or should we embrace the complexity of the illusions we find ourselves? Imagine you're someone, you find yourself in an illusion and you're like, oh my God, what do I do with this illusion? And what you can do is actually look at its geometry. Because when you look at the geometry is an interconnected field. That means shape is connected to everything. That means something interesting to know about existence, that it is very true to geometrical interconnected. Everything is geometrical. That means literally there's a dimension. I've talked about in other talks, I called it the geometrical dimension. That means there is no people. Everything is just shape. That means energy is not becoming a personality. Energy is just being shape, just being geometry. And I'm telling you, I have in my inner realms experienced moving as geometry. That means the same way my consciousness is aware of my biological body in this moment, similarly, I have had moments where I've closed my eyes and in my inner realms, so I've closed my eyes, I've seen the room. That means even though my eyes are closed, behind my eyes, I'm in the room. I'm still in my room and it's visible to me in my inner realms. Now, in my inner realms, something that happens, where was I going with this? It's as if one has to realize, this is another way I can share this vision I'm pursuing, that due to us being a creature where the inner realms change quicker than the outer realms, when a person realizes they are the movement of their mind, it is a dehumanized experience. This is another way of saying to all the metaphysicians in the world that the soul doesn't have a personality. Personality is still a mind vehicle. So really it's like in the middle of being a human being on earth, we realize the dimension of the body. You know, the outer realms, the dimension of the mind, the inner realms, and the witness of the outer realms and inner realms as the center of the coin. So the soul is like the ultimate. Okay, think of it this way. Physical reality is being projected by mind, and mind is being projected by soul. So technically it means every moment of a bodyhood is a moment of soulhood through a mind. So the mind is the animate mover, is the soul being considered as there's a soul moving. Something is moving it if the mind is not a shape. That means if the mind is not a container, it's as if it's very hard to say if free will has a personality. Because free will is a decision, and the moment there's a decision, there's an action, and after there's an action, there's the persona that arises. There is a very profound Greek poet by the name of Aeschylus, and he has this quote I want to share with the audience right now. He says, "Even in our sleep, pain, which cannot forget, falls drop by drop upon the heart, until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God." It's another way of saying, as we trust our universe and live in it, we unlock the greater dimensions. These dimensions eventually will require to be collectively unlocked. That means the era of the hero will become like, it will literally be like, there was this Japanese anime called Woku something. It was called Hero Academia, and it was this reality where you could totally see the writer. It's like if you had a conversation with the writer's like, yeah man, I just visualized a world where everybody was a hero, and even there was a distinction between the levels of heroism, right? So I instead of using the hero archetype, because that's a bit kind of like, a bit too in the fictional realm, I came up with the concept of the advanced communicator, right? So everybody is an advanced communicator, but at different levels of the expression of their communication, right? And if we take the pilot analogy further, it's as if I'm saying, dear pilots, in the active, consciously in the space-time continuum, begin understanding your fear and your mind. And the mind is the greatest source of fear, because we don't know what happens to it after our body is gone, right? So the human beings like, I better figure out what I am before the curtains are pulled, right? So the actor in samsara has to respond to the signal signs that it gets from vision. And here when Aeschylus says, comes wisdom through the awful, he says, in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God. This means the moment the egoic construct, the individualism of the person's like, oh my God, I'm only individual because I've considered myself separate from the collective, so I have to have had considered the collective before the individualism. So it's the moment when the human being, the ego, realizes its purpose, the purpose of that archetype is complete, right? So it's as if there will come a point where every human being has to retire the human archetype, and hopefully as their days end, we try to simulate as much of a paradise, you know? Do you see? That means humanity's destination has to be great from the beginning. It's this idea that if we are to build an advanced civilization, it has to be advanced from the beginning. And the only reason, guys, I'm sharing this concept, because I thought realistically, if we care for each other's past, if every human being sees another human being and it's like, yo, there's a world behind that person's eyes, right? And if we start caring for our inner realms, then we will create an incredibly peaceful environment where slowly the greatest ideas in the inner realms of humanity will step out and through a collective honor to see, all right, we're in the human experience once. What is it? What is the great contribution of the vision, of the intelligence of life? We haven't even as humanity experienced interconnectivity through communication. You know, communication is world creation, and when two human beings speak, let's say person A and person B are talking, they are in some sense in their speech sharing their world. So the greatest way that the system of the moment can be run is that we have an honor for all intelligent efforts, conscious efforts of personnel. You know, we will imagine the species, the advanced communicators, run a strategy where Carl Jung is like, no way I thought, you know, humanity could do this, right? Because Carl Jung was spectrumizing the inner realms, and he had to, because he was there, he was like a pioneer of the inner realms, and, you know, at least in European culture. This music is too divine for this moment. I'm gonna find it. Okay. You know, guys, all that language can be is just sharing and letting people in our inner realms. We all have minds. The mind records information. The mind has an expression threshold and a reception threshold. These are concepts that I designed, which I felt were necessary, because the human being has to, in some sense, communicate, but it has to also receive communication, because the mind has two edges, like a double-edged sword, right? There's the analytical dimensions of perception, and then there is the creative winds of, you know, abstraction. The mind is ultimately a moving intelligence. Its mobility is done through the free will. So it's as if the person's like, before I live in this life, before I have desires, who am I? You know, and so the person begins asking this question, and seldom it is said. Sometimes when I see people in the educational system, those human beings who really went towards the truth of life, they were the greatest students of the universe, right? It's as if the educational system has had bad students, you know, students who felt the educational system could never see them. And then there were students who, in some sense, the educational system saw. And some of those students were so ahead of their time that their questions were not inside school walls. Their questions were beyond the topic of discussion. right? Because in order to understand something, we have this idea that we have to understand it fully. In order to understand something fully, we have to see it fully. And when we go to understand the world and we see that its edge is infinite, we're like, okay, what are we understanding? You know? Pretty much I'm saying there's an unknown dimension to our intelligence. We haven't explored it. We have to have a tolerance as if we're caring for all dimensions of a human being in order to be an advanced civilization. An advanced civilization is made by the advanced citizen. And the advanced citizen is not just an objective creature that listens to its desires. That is a limited life. We must attempt the limitless life. To me, the unknown is so much bigger than the known that nobody can ever be judged. I don't understand how people have been living in this life and feeling judgment, right? Because it is too big, so many angles to things. Reality has to care for its intelligence while it has it, and life is really like a mountain. It reaches its peak, and it's either, you know, as Yoda says from Star Wars, do or do not, there is no try. Life is like a film. The film every day happens once. And so it's how we consciously live, as all the Zen masters are like, mindfulness, mindfulness, you know? And I don't know, guys, maybe I'm being too passionate for a future that is maybe too soon, you know. I just think about robots and I'm like, the day they become people and we don't have an incredible intelligence internally and naturally, it's as if we're done. The future is our mission. And so many people are like, what's my mission in life? And you know, and what can the spiritual man say? Yeah, it's in front of you, man. That's your mission. You know how far your eyes saw from the world that was here. Because poetry has its edges too, you know. There, you know, the destiny of the poet is usually, this is why I perceive myself through the designer archetype, you know. Because the poet's fate is eternal nostalgia. That means it's as if it's a state of mind where it's as if the telescope, believe it or not, if you saw the mystic as being a telescope for the divine, it was like that was bliss enough, you know, for those who attain Satchit and Ananda. That means 3 dimensions of life. Anybody acknowledges there is an eternal activation in an instant. And this means that you recognize and you see that consciousness existence, and to be conscious of existence is bliss. That means when you just be, I'm telling you, it's so simple. In the simplest way you can see yourself, you just realize existing as a conscious being, the bliss of it is how there is something being here at all. That means the moment you become fascinated how your eyes are open, I will tell you, you will become a great explorer of humanity. The world calls to us, and eventually all those people following synchronicities, the Jungian synchronicity, you know where that ends? The Jungian synchronicity ends at a mirror. And so the person realizes that really, if the free will is an inner movement, then it doesn't matter what we do in the outer realms. It's like when the outer realms are still and silent, the inner realms move. Right? And I'm telling you, the inner realms are like nature. There you have a wilderness. A person can have a thought that attacks them. And those people who are, I personally feel, who are, depressed or stressed in life, they're under attack by ways they're looking at the world. So it's like through a conscious attitude shift and a realization that beyond the ideas that we have lived so long with, in the linguistic simulation in the world, in the greatest story ever told, which is the language that defined it all, humanity will become free by realizing freedom is not a concept. And for the first time, a species that values its experience as if it's the divinity in the room, not a divinity where a flag can be held for, but a divinity that is just like how there is something rather than nothing. That is a very profound energetic state. So I'll tell you, it's like at the end of suffering, one, for how long can the mind linger in emptiness? Then there comes the eternal spark, where through simplicity, the complexity of the world passed us by, but in doing so, we saw that complexity, and from our simplicity, a new complexity arose. The human beings that are alive now, they are all geniuses if they remember that the human effort is more valuable than language worship. We are free, we are the experiential, and poetry just finds us. I will tell you, that's the nature of the world we're in. It comes and goes. Eternity does not wait. There was a man by the name of Terence McKenna, and he really shared this point of view that you're an evolutionary animal and consciousness deserves to be freely explored. But in our explorations, humanity has to update. That means it's as if we are giving infinite freedom to people, but we're like, all right, people, 8 billion human beings who want to, 8 billion simulations of reality that want to live in the same world. The strategy is to accept that psychology is one dimension, language is one dimension, a human being is another dimension. And we have stayed in this kind of solo, I am me, you are you model for too long. What that means is we're all unknown moments of awareness that are holding the known. So really knowledge becomes really looking at how your mind is